You have no idea what you signed, my creative director said into the conference room speaker, loud enough for the client on the other end to hear. 42 years old, lead designer at a brand agency for 11 years, and my boss just told a Fortune 500 client that my trademark work was legally worthless. While I sat right there at the table, I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I just slid my folder across the table and said, before we continue, could someone pull up Section 9C of my independent contractor addendum? That's when their $28 million agency contract evaporated. But let me back up. My name is not important right now. What's important is that I spent 11 years building the visual identity systems that every client in that room recognized as the agency's signature style, the grid methodology, the color language framework, the typographic hierarchy system we licensed to 3 national retail chains. I built all of it. And for a long time, nobody thought to ask whose name was actually on it. The conference room smelled like recycled air and expensive coffee from the machine nobody actually liked, but everyone used because it was there. The client, a regional insurance conglomerate trying to reposition their brand for a younger demographic, had flown in 2 executives just for this pitch. My creative director had been rehearsing this presentation for 3 weeks. I know because I could hear him practicing through the wall of his office every afternoon after 4. He'd invited me to the pitch because he needed the portfolio work in the room. Not me. The portfolio. I understood that distinction by then. Took me a few years longer than it should have. His name was Neil. Neil Packard, 47. Came up through account management on the East Coast before pivoting to creative leadership in a way that mostly meant he was excellent at presenting other people's ideas with the confidence of someone who'd thought of them himself. He had a gift for rooms, I'll give him that. Could walk into any space and immediately become the most credible-seeming person in it. Clients loved him. He wore it well. What Neil didn't have was any technical understanding of what he was selling. He knew the vocabulary, brand equity, visual language, scalable systems, but he used those words the way someone uses a foreign phrase they learned phonetically. Correct sound, wrong meaning. I'd watched him do it for years. At first I found it harmless. A little irritating, but harmless. The work still got done. Clients were happy. I was getting paid. Then he hired my replacement. Her name was Jessie, 28, MFA from a school with a good reputation, Instagram portfolio full of the kind of geometric gradients that look impressive in a presentation and fall apart the moment you try to apply them at scale. Neil introduced her as a visionary. His word, visionary. Like I needed a dictionary. She wasn't malicious. I want to be clear about that. She was just young and being positioned by someone who benefited from her, not knowing what she didn't know yet. Neil put her in client-facing meetings. Let her present work I'd developed. Started describing her as the creative force behind our methodology. The same one I'd documented in a 140-page brand standards manual that still had my initials in the footer on every single page. I noticed the shift, the way you notice water rising. Slowly, then all at once. First, it was the internal reviews I stopped getting invited to. Then my name started disappearing from the case studies on the agency website. Work I'd led, work I'd bled over, work that had won 2 regional ADDY awards, now attributed to the creative team. Then Neil started referring to the brand framework in pitches as something the agency had developed in-house over several years, which was technically accurate if you defined the agency as me. My wife noticed before I said anything out loud. She works in HR for a mid-size manufacturing company. She sees the machinery of how people get managed out of organizations, and she spotted the pattern before I'd fully admitted it to myself. You need to talk to someone, she said one night. Not a colleague, a lawyer. I told her I thought she was overreacting. She was not overreacting. The thing about being a designer in an agency environment is that everyone treats creative work like it belongs to the room where it happened. Like proximity to an idea means ownership of it. Neil had been in meetings where I presented early concepts. He'd been copied on emails where I walked clients through rationale. He'd sat across from me at workshops where I developed the methodology live, explaining my thinking as I went. In his mind, I think he genuinely believed that made it collaborative. that his presence during creation was a form of co-authorship. He was wrong about that, legally. But the moment I understood he believed it, I started getting very careful about documentation. I went back through everything, 4 years of files, timestamp sketches in my personal cloud storage, version histories in the design software we used, every iteration with my login credentials attached, emails where I explained the thinking behind specific decisions, a copyright registration I'd filed in 2021 on the core brand framework, not for the agency but in my own name because I'd developed the initial version before I was even employed there as part of a freelance system I'd been building independently. I'd disclosed this to the agency when I was hired. It was in my contractor addendum, Section 9C. I'll be honest, when I first negotiated that clause, I wasn't thinking about this exact scenario. I was thinking about protecting side work. I'd always done freelance, always planned to continue, and I wanted clarity about what belonged to me versus what belonged to the agency. The language I asked for was specific. Any methodology, framework, or system developed prior to employment or developed using personal resources outside of work hours remained my intellectual property. The agency got a license to use it, not ownership. Their general counsel at the time thought I was being overly cautious about something minor. He signed it. Neil signed it. The agency's managing partner signed it. Everybody signed it because nobody thought it would ever matter. 6 years later, it mattered. The slide Neil was presenting when this all unraveled was called Our Signature Approach, a framework built for scale. 12 slides, full of language I recognized because I'd written a version of it in an internal strategy document 3 years earlier. The framework he was licensing to this insurance client for a 7-year engagement, the one he was calling the agency's proprietary methodology, was the system I'd built. The one my copyright registration described in specific detail. The one Section 9C of my addendum said I owned. I'd known for about 6 weeks that this pitch was coming. I'd found out by accident, overhearing a hallway conversation I wasn't supposed to hear. And instead of saying anything, I did what I always do with information. I held it, thought about it, made sure I understood it completely before deciding what to do with it. The client's procurement team had sent over a due diligence questionnaire, standard for contracts above a certain dollar threshold. One of the questions asked the agency to confirm ownership of all proprietary methodologies being licensed. Neil had answered yes, confirmed ownership, signed his name to it. I sat in that pitch with my folder in front of me. Inside the folder, a copy of my copyright registration, a copy of Section 9C, a copy of Neil's due diligence confirmation, and a letter from an intellectual property attorney I'd consulted 2 weeks prior, laying out, in plain language, the problem with what Neil had just certified. I waited until he got to slide 9, the one with the framework diagram, the one with the agency's name in the corner where my initials used to be. Before we continue, I said, could someone pull up Section 9C of my independent contractor addendum? Neil laughed. The kind of laugh that's covering something. He said something about this not being the time for internal administrative questions. It's not internal, I said. This client is about to sign a 7-year licensing agreement for a methodology that the agency doesn't own. I think they'd want to know that before they sign. The silence was the kind that happens when everyone in the room realizes simultaneously that something has gone very wrong and nobody knows yet how wrong. One of the client's executives, the older one, operations background, from the look of him, leaned forward. What do you mean the agency doesn't own it? Neil tried to steer the room. Said something about intellectual property being a complex area. Said the agency's legal team would be happy to clarify. Said we should take a short break. I slid the folder across the table. The copyright registration is filed under my name, I said. The contractor addendum, signed by agency leadership, confirms I retain ownership of this framework. The agency holds a license, not title. What's being offered in this contract is something that isn't theirs to sell. The operations executive picked up the folder. His colleague started typing into her laptop. Neil stood at the front of the room, looking like a man who'd just discovered the floor was not where he thought it was. This doesn't affect the quality of the work, Neil said. We can resolve any ownership questions quickly. You told our procurement team you owned this, the operations executive said, in writing, 3 weeks ago. Neil didn't have an answer for that. I stayed calm. I want to be clear that I felt calm. This wasn't something I'd been building toward out of anger. By that point, the anger had converted into something more useful. It had become patience. 11 years of patience, and then one Tuesday morning in a conference room on the 14th floor, the client excused themselves to make calls. Neil cornered me by the windows. "What are you doing?" he said. "My job," I said, which apparently includes making sure clients aren't misled about what they're buying. He told me I was sabotaging the agency. I told him the agency had been building on a foundation they didn't own. There was a difference between those two things, and he was about to understand it precisely. My wife had asked me the night before if I was sure about this. I'd thought about it for a long time before answering her. Not the legal part. I was sure about that. The personal part. Whether I was doing this out of principle or out of something less clean. Here's what I told her. I told her I'd watched 3 years of my work get presented as someone else's contribution. I'd watched a client give a standing ovation to a methodology I'd spent 18 months developing while I sat in the back row because Neil thought designers should be background resources during presentations, not spokespeople. I'd watched Jessie get promoted into a creative director title that should have had my name on it, using a rationale that credited her with developing a system she'd been using for 11 months. I'd brought this up twice through appropriate channels. HR meeting in February, formal written grievance in June. Both went nowhere. What I was doing wasn't revenge, I told her. It was correction. I'd been patient long enough for correction to happen on its own. It hadn't happened. So I was going to be the one to make it happen. She refilled her coffee and said, "Just make sure your paperwork is clean." It was clean. I'd had 3 people check it. The client left that meeting without signing anything. They sent a formal notice 2 days later requesting a complete audit of the agency's intellectual property holdings before any further discussions. That audit took 6 weeks. By the end of it, the agency's legal team had identified 14 instances of work attributed to the agency that traced back, at least partially, to frameworks or systems I'd developed independently. Neil's managing partner called me during week 3 of the audit. His name was Stuart. I'd always liked Stuart, mostly because he stayed out of creative decisions and let people do their work. He sounded tired in a way that wasn't about lack of sleep. "We need to talk about a resolution," he said. I told him I was open to that. The conversation lasted 40 minutes. Stuart was reasonable, which I'd expected. Neil was on a different call, I learned later, with the agency's insurance carrier. What I wanted was simple in structure, if not in dollar amount. A formal acknowledgement that the framework was my intellectual property, a retroactive licensing agreement that compensated me fairly for the 6 years the agency had used it, and going forward, either a buyout at fair market value or an ongoing royalty arrangement at a rate my attorney had calculated based on comparable licensing deals in the brand consultancy industry. Stuart asked what fair market value looked like. My attorney had prepared a valuation. We gave Stuart the number. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That's significant." "I know," I said. "It would have been less significant if we'd had this conversation 6 years ago." He didn't have an answer for that either. It took 4 months to finalize the agreement. I stayed involved with the agency during that time. I had ongoing client relationships that deserved continuity, and walking out in the middle of active projects wasn't something I was willing to do. But my role changed. Not officially. Not with a new title or announcement, just in practice. The client calls started coming to me directly. The case study started carrying my name again. Neil went quieter in meetings, which made the meetings shorter and more functional. Jessie and I had a real conversation about 2 months in. She'd figured out the general shape of what was happening. Hard not to, given that 2 partners and 3 senior staff had called me into closed-door meetings in a single week. She wasn't angry at me. She was mortified, I think, that she'd been used the way she had been without fully realizing it. "I didn't know the framework wasn't agency developed," she said. "I thought it was just ours. Something that had been built before I got here." "It was built before you got here," I said. "By me." She nodded, sat with that. "What do I do?" she said. "My whole portfolio at this point is built on document what you actually created," I said. "The parts you designed, the thinking you contributed, the pieces that are genuinely yours. You have real work. Separate that from what was handed to you." She looked like someone recalculating a long trip after discovering they'd been pointed the wrong direction from the start. "You'll be fine," I said. "But from now on, read what you sign." The settlement came through on a Thursday. Wire transfer. Cleared same day. The kind of number that makes you sit quietly in your kitchen for a few minutes before you do anything else. I left the agency formally 30 days after that. No drama. No announcement beyond what was professionally necessary. My clients were informed through a standard transition communication. Several of them asked if they could continue working with me independently. I said yes to 3 of them. Started a small studio out of my home office, then rented a proper space 6 months later when it became clear this wasn't going to be a short-term arrangement. Just me and 2 designers I'd worked with before, people who understood that the work comes first and the credit follows the person who actually did the work. My wife walked through the studio space the weekend before we officially opened. She ran her hand along the main table, looked at the light coming through the window, and said it felt like something that had always been about to happen. I think she was right. Neil left the agency 8 months after I did. I heard through the industry network that the managing partner had quietly restructured his role after 2 more client relationships deteriorated. He's consulting now, I think. Something adjacent to brand strategy. I don't follow it closely. The insurance conglomerate ended up coming to us, not through the agency, directly through one of the executives who'd been in that conference room. She remembered who'd been sitting at the table with the folder. Turns out operations executives respect that kind of thing. Their engagement with us started at 9 months. We're in the 2nd year now. Jessie came to work with us 11 months ago. She's a solid designer when she's working in an environment that credits people correctly for what they do. She brings good thinking to the problems, asks better questions than she did 2 years ago, and she reads her contracts now. She told me that specifically, without prompting. She mentioned it on her first week, said she'd read every page before signing. I told her I was glad to hear it. The thing people don't understand about intellectual property is that it isn't abstract. It's the actual work. The hours at the desk, the failed directions, the 27th revision of something that finally clicks into being right, the documentation that explains why you made the choices you made. All of that has a legal reality that most people in creative fields have never been told about. They're taught to focus on the work and trust that the work will take care of them. It won't. The work will take care of whoever has the paperwork in order. I've talked to other designers since then, and architects, and engineers, and people who write software, and people who build systems that their employers use for years without ever being asked how the system actually works. Most of them have no idea what they signed when they joined their company. Most of them assume the standard contract is just the standard contract formality, routine, same as everyone else's. It isn't always the same, and the parts that are different are the parts that matter. A brand strategist in Atlanta reached out to me recently through a mutual connection. She'd been at her firm for 9 years, built their signature research methodology from scratch, watched a new managing partner bring in a younger team and gradually edge her out of visibility. She'd seen the coverage of what had happened with our agency situation. She asked if I had any advice. I told her what I've told everyone who's asked. Find your original work. Find the timestamps, the drafts, the emails where you explained your thinking. Go back to your contract and read it completely, not the summary someone gave you, the actual document. If the language around intellectual property feels vague or unfair, get an attorney to look at it while you still have leverage, not after the problem happens. Before. She wrote back a few days later, said she'd found a clause in her contract that specifically excluded work developed using her pre-existing research framework from the firm's IP claim. Said she hadn't known it was there. She'd signed it 4 years ago and never read it. I'm not telling this story because I want credit for being clever. I want to be clear about that. What happened in that conference room wasn't a plan I executed flawlessly from the beginning. It was the result of being careful about one small thing. One clause in one addendum, at a moment when I wasn't even thinking about the future, that eventually arrived. I was just thinking about protecting the freelance work I cared about. That's all I was trying to do. The rest of it came from paying attention, from noticing what was happening around me and deciding to document it instead of ignore it, from understanding that patience isn't the same as passivity, from my wife who told me to talk to a lawyer when I still thought she was being dramatic, I'm 44 now, running a studio with 8 people, which is honestly about as large as I want it to get. We do brand identity work for mid-sized companies who are serious about their visual systems. We don't do trendy, we do durable. There's a market for that if you find it. Every person on my team owns the work they create here. It's written into our founding documents. Not because I'm idealistic about it, but because I know exactly what happens when that isn't the case. And I don't want to build something on a foundation that's going to crack the first time someone decides to test it. My daughter is 16. She's interested in graphic design, or thinks she might be, in the way teenagers are interested in things before they understand what they actually require. I try not to push her toward it or away from it. But I did tell her one thing when she mentioned it. Whatever you build, I said, make sure you know who owns it. She asked why. Because someday, I said, someone in a room is going to tell you that you don't understand what you signed, and you want to be the person in that room who actually does. She seemed to file that away somewhere. Kids do that. They hear things and you don't know if it landed until 3 years later when they mention it again out of nowhere. I hope it landed. The studio is profitable. We're growing at a pace I can actually manage without burning through people. The insurance client renewed. We picked up a healthcare non-profit last quarter and a regional bank the quarter before that. Steady work, clients who respect the process, a team that shows up and does things that matter. Not bad for a Tuesday morning with a folder and one clause nobody thought to read. I've thought a lot about what actually happened in that conference room, not the legal mechanics of it. I understood those before I walked in. What I think about is the sequence. How one small decision I made years earlier, a single clause I asked for in an addendum that nobody thought would ever matter, became the thing that changed everything. Not because I was playing a long game, because I was just trying to be careful about something I cared about. That's the part people miss when they hear stories like this. They assume there was a master plan, some calculated strategy laid out years in advance. There wasn't. There was just the habit of paying attention, of reading what I signed, of keeping records not because I expected to need them, but because good documentation is what professionals do, the same way a contractor photographs work before the drywall goes up. You hope you never need it. You keep it anyway. Neil spent 11 years in the same industry I did and never developed that habit. He was talented at what he did. I mean that sincerely. The man could walk into a room and make people believe in something, but he confused presentation with creation, and he confused proximity with ownership, and eventually those confusions caught up with him in a way that couldn't be walked back, not because the universe was balancing a ledger, just because reality has a way of asserting itself when the gap between what someone claims and what's actually true gets wide enough. What I want people to take from this, if they take anything, is that protecting your work isn't aggressive. It isn't paranoid. It isn't some adversarial stance you take against the people you work with. It's just honesty about what you actually made and a reasonable expectation that your name stays attached to it. The moment I understood that Neil was operating as though my work belonged to the room where it happened, I had a choice. I could let it continue and absorb the loss quietly, or I could be precise about what was mine and stand behind that precision. I chose precision, not out of anger, out of self-respect. My wife had been telling me for a year that I needed to talk to someone. I kept thinking she was overreacting. She wasn't. She understood something I was too close to see. That patience without documentation is just waiting to lose, and that nobody was going to correct this situation for me. I had to be the one to correct it. So I did, quietly, carefully, with a folder and one clause nobody had bothered to read. Jessie is a good designer. She's better now than she was 2 years ago. And part of that is because she's finally working somewhere that tells her the truth about what she's creating and who it belongs to. She told me once that she wished someone had explained the ownership question to her before she signed her first contract. I told her most people learn it too late. The ones who learn it early are the ones who come out of these situations with something intact. That's the thing about doing your work carefully and documenting it honestly and understanding what you signed. Nobody hands you credit for any of that. It just quietly becomes the foundation you're standing on when everything else gets tested. And foundations matter, especially the parts that nobody thinks they'll ever need.